Hi, I'm Matt Mayfield, and you're watching the Audio Fundamentals course. Today we're going to talk about microphone concepts. There are types of microphones, which you've probably heard of, condenser, dynamic, and ribbon mics. There are various pickup patterns or polar patterns that microphones have, and we will also look at a quick example of proximity effect. Now, the first thing that I want to clear up that a lot of people get confused about is that there are two different attributes to a microphone. There's the type of microphone and there is the pattern that the microphone has. And you've heard these terms. There's omnidirectional, there's cardioid. Those are patterns that the microphone can have. And there are condenser microphones and dynamic microphones, and those refer to the structure of the microphone and also a bit about the sound of it. Now, you could have an omnidirectional condenser mic, an omnidirectional dynamic mic, a cardioid condenser mic, or a cardioid dynamic mic. All those are possible. The type and pattern are two different things, and they don't affect each other for the most part. The three main types use completely different mechanical structures, and those have an impact on the sound, mostly relating to how large and bulky, relatively speaking, the diaphragm is that the sound waves need to move in order to register electricity inside the microphone. The dynamic mic on the left, whenever sound waves hit it, they're moving an entire coil of wire, an electromagnet, and that means that it is slower to respond to the sound waves than the condenser mic in the middle that just has a diaphragm suspended in air in a hoop that is much lighter weight, and so it can respond more quickly to the sound waves, and the ribbon mic, which has a tiny, tiny piece of metallic ribbon suspended between two poles of a magnet. Let's look at some general characteristics of most microphones of each of these three types. Relative to each other, it's harder to damage a dynamic microphone than a condenser or a ribbon microphone. Ribbon mics are extremely fragile, and on some of the older models, even a puff of air, if they're not guarded with a windscreen, can cause the tiny little ribbon to attach to one of the poles of the magnet, thus requiring the microphone to be repaired. Dynamic microphones don't need any phantom power. That's a clever way of putting 48 volts DC along the microphone cable while simultaneously getting the audio down the microphone cable. Condenser mics always need some sort of power supply, either phantom power or some of them have their own power supplies or batteries, things like that. Ribbon microphones are sometimes damaged by phantom power depending on the specific mic. Most modern ones aren't, but older ones can be. One advantage to dynamic microphones is that they handle extremely loud sounds very well. Condenser microphones don't so much, they tend to distort more quickly. While ribbon mics, again, with strong enough sound waves, it might break the ribbon or cause it to stick to one side of the magnet. A term that's useful to define is transient response, and that's how quickly the microphone can respond to extremely fast sounds. So with dynamic microphones with the diaphragm that has more inertia, it will tend to gloss over tiny details in the sound, which is useful in some purposes. Meanwhile, the condenser and ribbon microphones have a much quicker transient response, and they will be clearer and more detailed, but sometimes that's not the sound you want. For example, in microphones with a very quick transient response, sometimes there's an exaggerated amount of tiny clicks and pops and mouth sounds from vocals that a dynamic mic doesn't really pick up. Finally, even though the pickup pattern is independent mostly of the microphone type, it's easier to make some types of microphones in certain patterns than others, particularly the ribbon microphone, which is nearly always a figure 8 mic. But the dynamic and condenser mics can usually be any of the patterns. Here's what these patterns look like in 2 dimensions. The omnidirectional pattern picks up evenly in all directions. Now this looks like a circle on screen, but really this is a sphere, a 3-dimensional pattern. The microphone can pick up sound from any angle, above, below, to the side, behind it, in front, anywhere. The cardioid pickup pattern is named because it looks something like a heart, cardio referring to the heart and oid meaning the shape of. Now remember, this pattern also picks up in a similar shape going up and down from it as well as side to side. Supercardioid and hypercardioid are both similar in that they trade off less of a wide pickup pattern in the front in exchange for some leakage from the back. That means that the dead spot, instead of being directly behind the microphone, it turns into a ring at an angle to directly behind the microphone. And finally, we have the bidirectional or figure 8 pattern, which picks up each side evenly and has 2 extremely non-sensitive spots at the sides. And again, in 3 dimensions, this would look more like a barbell than a figure 8. The polar patterns or pickup patterns are especially important when you are using multiple mics simultaneously, such as on a drum set. In this case, you're very carefully choosing your microphones to minimize leakage. It's also important for controlling room sound. If you think about an omnidirectional mic, it's going to pick up the echoes coming off the wall behind it just as sensitively as it's picking up the sound source in front of it. Whereas a cardioid microphone is almost dead to the wall behind it and picking up at full strength the sound source right in front of it. There's also something called proximity effect. Proximity effect is a change in tone as you get closer to the microphone, and it happens mostly on directional patterns, not the omnidirectional pattern. It's mostly a bass boost, but there's an interesting change in tone as you get closer to the microphone. In this example, you'll hear both the difference in room sound to direct sound as I increase the gain to compensate for being further away from the microphone, and you'll also hear the proximity effect change in tone. This is the sound of an omnidirectional condenser microphone from about 2 feet away. This is the sound of the same omnidirectional condenser microphone from about 2 inches away. This is the sound of a cardioid condenser microphone from about 2 feet away. This is the sound of the same cardioid condenser microphone from about 2 inches away. You may note the proximity effect. Now, the thing to remember here is that it happens on all sound sources. So if you are recording a kick drum, for example, and you want to increase the bass, you might take advantage of proximity effect in your positioning of the microphone. Positioning can make a huge difference in the sound that a microphone picks up. At the simplest level, if you position it close to the source, you get a drier sound, and if you position it further away, you get more of the room tone. There could be entire episodes devoted to this, and I do intend to make these eventually. There are all sorts of topics that you could get into, such as bleed from multiple mics and the way that it combines, polarity versus phase, comb filtering, stereo miking, all sorts of things. For now, we'll leave it at that, and if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them on YouTube, and thanks a lot for watching.